There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger said, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So the father divided his property and gave to the younger son what he had. So the young son took all he had and headed off to a distant country where he blew his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he was deeply in need. He hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and I'm starving to death? I will go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired men.' So he got up and he went to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, ran to his son and threw his arms around and kissed him. 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the servants, 'Bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they all began to celebrate. The older son was in the field. As he neared the house, he heard music and dancing and called to one of the servants and said, 'What's going on?' 'Your brother has come back and your father has killed the fatted calf because he is back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been working for you, never disobeyed your orders. You never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' And the father said, 'Son, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours.' But we had to celebrate and be glad because his brother of yours was dead, is alive again. He was lost, found." The word from the Lord in the house of the Lord. Joe Petrosini got up with terrible back pain. He gave him painkillers and scheduled an x-ray, and that's as much as we know. That's why Joe's not at the door today. Manna from heaven, it was there every day for the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness until they finally got where he wanted them to be and said, "Now you are 100% cured of any trace of bondage to the Egyptians. You're on your own." And with that, they found out they could grow grain and make their own feast. And there was no more manna. Kind of like the kids, right? They get to a point where you're on your own, kids. There is no more manna. Sure, there isn't. You know, what I'm really glad about is that there weren't cell phones when my kids were in high school, because I'd have gone bankrupt buying them. You know, you buy one, an hour later it's obsolete. I got to do that. I had a good friend who had one of the very first car phones that were around. And his joy was to drive through town, pull up beside like a convertible, make his phone ring and hand it out the window and say, "It's for you." You know, I don't know why I thought of that. We lived near Madison, and he would love to do that on the campus. But back to business. God provided as long as they needed him to provide. God provided until they were able to take care of themselves. And then he expected that of them. He said, "I've freed you of your bondage. I've given you the promised land. Now it's up to you." And for a while it was fine, and then they complained, just as we always do. We're like the We're like the prodigal son. Now, the prodigal doesn't mean that he went off into a far distance and all that. Prodigal simply means wasteful. He was a wasteful son. He had blessings and he blew them. He threw them away. He got tied up with friends who were willing to party with him as long as he could pay the bill. And when he no longer had any money, they disappeared. Can you imagine the horrible fate of a good Jewish boy having to feed the hogs, the most unclean animal there was, and he was out taking care of the unclean? He must have felt he had stooped to the absolute bottom of the world. And he said, I'll go home and I'll ask forgiveness from my dad. No, I'll ask if I can work for my dad because my dad's a good guy. He took his first step toward home and his father met him. Put a party, blew a big party for him, celebrated for him. And his older brother said, why in the world? I get nothing and he gets everything? And the father said, it's always been yours. But he was dead and now he's alive. He took one step toward home. He made one turn in his life after all of that crap. And that's all it took for his father to find him and forgive him. Now, I don't think most of us ever reached that depth that he did, because there couldn't have been anything lower than a Jewish boy feeding the hogs. That couldn't have been anything worse than that. And then he turned. But you know, a lot of us do a lot of things. We spend too much time, we spend too much money on hobbies and so forth. Now, buying golf balls is not included in that. They make 3 billion golf balls a year in this country, and I lose my share. But I'm providing jobs for people. But we get involved, and we get so deeply involved in things, and it's possible. It's hard to believe, but it's possible even to get so wrapped up in golf that it's the most important thing in your life. I don't understand that, but I guess it's possible. But we get into things. We get into music. We get into art. We get into so many things that take us away from a relationship with our Father, with our relationship with our God. And that's being prodigal. That's wasting the perfect relationship. And it isn't always something, I'm not trying to say those things are evil or they're vile or there's anything wrong with them, but they become all-consuming. There was a time when I was a sports official and I thought I was a pretty good one, and I had a partner who, between us, we were good on the basketball floor, and we had been scouted, and we were even in line to begin working toward the Mid-America Conference and the Big Ten Conference. And if I had done those things, I would have been a proud official, and I would have been single. One season, in an 18-week season, I worked 50 varsity high school basketball games. You figure the math. The only thing that saved my marriage, I honestly believe it, was when I changed jobs and moved. And I began to realize when we had to start over as a couple, when we had to start over as a family, that we were more important to each other than the things I was doing. Yeah, I was a great official. I was good at it. The year we moved from Michigan to Wisconsin, on the 1st of December, I had already had contracts offered for 50 games in the next season, not the one we were beginning, but the next year's season. That's how our reputation was. And I would have been single, and she'd have been justified in doing it. I was lost. I had become so prodigal in the relationship that we had by connecting with a relationship that wasn't that important. But I finally had to make a change. I finally had to turn. I had to make one step back to where God wanted me to be. I could have been run out of a lot more towns than I was if I hadn't given it up. And that's what the youth had to decide. He finally had to decide that his pride wasn't important. He finally had to decide that his choices weren't all that important. He finally had to decide that what God had in mind for him was what was important. And we all make these kinds of mistakes. We all get hung up on little things, and they become big things, and they get it between us and our relationship with God. And that's where things go wrong. You see, I was a really good basketball official, but I wasn't satisfied. I also did wrestling and baseball and softball and football. Started track meets, and there wasn't a season I didn't do. And I look back and think, man, I was so lucky to find a new job, because I never would have found a new wife like this one. The prodigal turned, and all he had to do was turn. He didn't have to make progress. He had to simply realize what it was that was standing between him and God, and let God take care of it. He didn't have to change very much. He had to want to change very much. He didn't have to be so different than he had been. He had to want to be different. And if we will come to God with a desire to be different than we are, He will make us wonderful. He will make us exceptional. He will make us extraordinary. In good time, He will perfect us in His love. But He can't do it while we're separated. He can't change us. He can't make us what we ought to be when we are obsessed with something besides Him. And we have to be careful. The obsessions don't have to be big, huge things. They don't have to be criminal. They don't have to be splashy. They don't have to be major, but we have to watch out that we don't let things become so important to us that we can't change. That's the story of the prodigal. It's not about feeding the pigs in the fields. It's not about wasting money. It's not about even the big brother being jealous because the kid got more than he got. No, he didn't. The big brother got God's love every day. And those who don't get sidetracked have the benefit of God's love every day. But unless you're like me, unless you're not like me, you'll find a way to somewhere in your life have become the prodigal, to have found something that gets between you and your relationship with God. And when you realize it's there, get rid of it. Because He will make you different with a turn and one step. He will make you perfect in the end, if you let Him. But you can't always be in charge. So yeah, I made quite a bit of money back in the good old days. Always had change in my pocket because doing 3 basketball games a week and getting mileage, you got to be very good. But I almost lost a family because I was too busy feeding the pigs in the field. One step, one turn, home. Amen. Amen. Just one step from peace, one step from joy, one turn, one step away from Christ. Go in that peace. Find that peace. Live in that peace. Amen.